I'm Hirra Adeogun, Head of Car Free Cities at Possible. At Possible, we want to see a zero carbon society built by and for everyone, and we want to see that fast. So I'm here to welcome you to the Reimagining London, Paris and New York Summit, our launch of the Car Free Megacities campaign. This campaign brings to life a positive vision for major cities to move away from mass private car ownership. We want to take space away from cars and give it back to people and nature. From the outset, let's be clear, a car-free city is a city which is free of the dangers, pollution and emissions caused by mass private car ownership. It's not a city with no cars at all. We recognise there are many people, including disabled people, who can't get around without a car, and our campaign to reduce the number of cars in cities will make their lives easier too. So our aim is to improve the livability of cities by dramatically reducing the number of cars on the road. At the same time, we'll promote best practice internationally. You're going to hear from some wonderful organisations and grassroots initiatives who are already doing amazing work on the ground right now. And we'll encourage and inspire decision makers to raise ambitions and accelerate change at the city level. We've got some brilliant representatives from the 3 cities later this afternoon to discuss what they've been working on and their future plans for their cities. This project is a collaboration with the New Weather Institute, the Active Travel Academy, Brooklyn Spoke, and Paris Sans Voiture. I'm going to invite our partners to introduce themselves and give us a quick insight into why this campaign is so necessary right now. So let me first go to Andrew Sims from the New Weather Institute.
Thanks so much, Hirra. Yes, I work with the New Weather Institute and coordinate an initiative called the Rapid Transition Alliance as well. And I thought I'd start off, because we're probably going to hear a lot of information, a lot of facts, with sort of a personal statement about why this campaign matters to me so much. One of the earliest photos I have of myself is sat on an old-fashioned car on a carousel at a local zoo. And when I was growing up, all of life seemed to revolve around the car. And the ride that I sat on as a child now seems to me like kind of quite a powerful metaphor. It was a car stuck in tracks like a rut going round and round. Now, in reality, I actually never learned to drive like all of my friends did as soon as they turned 17. And they usually sort of ended up in a ditch on a Friday night, either going to or back from the pub. But I stood by and I watched my hometown get paved over and cut in half by big multi-lane through roads. I saw the roads filled with traffic and more of my friends and other children puffing on asthma inhalers as the pollution grew. I listened to the traffic noise. I saw the dead animals by the roadside. I saw the head-on crashes and the human toll. And on TV, I heard the endless praise for the great car economy and the crazy status games that get played out in adverts on TV and in the press, and the driveways and school runs of suburban Britain. And all the alternatives of public transport seemed expensive and increasingly run down. Then I became aware of the climate crisis and where a lot of the pollution causing it was coming from. And I thought there had to be a better way. And I think there was and always has been. We've all heard the history of the red carpet that gets rolled out for the private car, the deliberate undermining of urban mass transit. In the UK, the wrecking of the branch railway networks, the subsidised infrastructure, the unpaid health and environmental costs, yet another subsidy, and the other direct state support. But now we know there's a better way ahead, a world where we provide more space for people and nature, turn to active travel that's better for us and the biosphere, switch to the green collar economy where pound for pound, dollar for dollar and euro for euro, we get more jobs and better quality of life. Now, we've had a few glimpses of that during lockdown. We've seen the pioneering work done by some towns, but now we think it's the turn of the megacities to be pioneers. And that's what this campaign is all about. We've got an extraordinary opportunity now to win for people, nature, the economy and life in our cities by promoting active travel and mass transit and relegating expensive, polluting and slow, congested private cars. We know that we know what the possibilities are. And this campaign is about making more people aware of them and creating a situation where we have the ability to choose a better, viable future with choices that we make now while there's still time to act. Thanks, Hirra.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for those beautiful reflections. I'm going to head to Cathy Lamri from Paris-Sans Voiture.
Hello, so I'm Cathy Lamri. I'm from the association Paris-Sans Voiture. I will make a brief introduction of what our association is and why we are delighted to participate in this mega project between our three cities. We're all heading in the same direction, so let's go there all together. And I wanted to say that today is the 3rd of March and the Ile-de-France region is facing another episode of pollution by microparticles, which forced the municipality to take measures today like traffic restrictions and free public parking. So we're really in the heart of what we're discussing. So Paris-Sans Voiture is a group of men and women living in Paris who, in 2014, proposed to Mrs. Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, to organize a full day without cars in Paris. And since then, we've been discussing with the municipality in total independence. So Paris-Sans Voiture is an independent initiative that wants all the citizens of Paris to become actors of the changes in their city. We bring new ideas and we support the whole process, and we try to keep a critical and constructive point of view so this initiative can bring some permanent changes in our city. This Journée sans voiture, a car-free day, is an experience of a nicer city, a day of celebration full of surprises, but also, and more than anything, a day to celebrate the commitment of our citizens. It's also a good opportunity to rediscover our streets by opening them to creativity and by promoting clean means of transportation. This car-free day is not focused on banning automobiles, but is an opportunity to think about sharing public spaces and to speed up the change in our relation to cars. We really want this event to be a trigger for our politicians in order to reduce the importance of cars in our cities and to foster a more sustainable future. For example, in order to clear our vision of all these cars, we simply made them disappear for a brief period of time. We also want to redefine what is possible and what is not, and tackle pollution with positive and thought-provoking actions like, for example, the unauthorized picnic on the Place de la Concorde Square. Thanks to a call for projects open to all the residents, the Quartier Libre initiative allowed citizens to reclaim their neighborhoods. So we turned a car-free day into a day with a lot of different things happening in the street and open to all the inhabitants of Paris. Our objective is to start with a single day every year and evolve into a city where the air we breathe won't make us sick and where we can hear the birds sing every day. We want other cities to be inspired by the experiment in Paris, just like we were inspired by other initiatives throughout the world, like, for example, La Voie Libre on the motorway near the city of Montreuil, or the Day Without Cars in Brussels. So it was a great pleasure for us to join this Car Free Megacity initiative, which encompasses 3 dimensions that are very important to us. The awareness that we need to make our cities evolve quickly, a positive interaction with our elected representatives by making new proposals and not only opposing their policies, as it is often the case, and the need to share our experience. And to be honest, we all want to live every day in a city that smells good and that is bursting with life. And we want personal cars and motorcycles to be exceptions in Paris and in all the major cities. We are often seen as dreamers, but we all know that utopia leads to reality. I would like to make you listen to a short audio file of what we would like to hear in Paris. That's all for me, thank you.
Thank you, Cathy. I think we had some bird sounds. Is that right? That Cathy wanted to share?
Yes. Yes. I can start the audio from my computer. What I would like to hear is this. Can you hear them?
That was beautiful. Thank you, Cathy.
Merci.
Thank you so much. I loved those bird sounds. They're so peaceful, and that's kind of, we want more birds and we want more nature. And absolutely no language barrier with bird songs. So I'm going to hand over to Doug Gordon, who heads up Brooklyn Spoke, to introduce himself and chair our first session. Will cars become the third wheel in these global megacities? So take it away, Doug.
Thank you, Hirra. I hope everyone can hear me all right. My name's Doug Gordon, and yeah, I'm a Safe Streets advocate here in New York. I'm based in Brooklyn. I'm also the co-host of a podcast called The War on Cars. And, you know, for me, I think part of the reason I'm happy to be involved with this is that a lot of climate action sometimes is framed as a sacrifice, as something you have to give up. But when it comes to bicycle advocacy and safe streets and cities for people, making a climate-friendly city is something that you get, something that you gain, something that improves your life. It means, for me, that my kids can walk to school by themselves or meet their friends. It means biking to work and getting a little exercise and not being afraid of getting hit by a car. It just means birdsong. It means being calmer and more relaxed. So I hope that as we go forward throughout the day, everybody really thinks about the positive things that will come out of a car-free city, a car-free neighborhood, a car-free block just where you live. And that's what it means for me personally. So I don't want to take up too much time talking about myself. I want to move things over and start our first session. So yes, we're going to be talking just generally about, you know, what will it take for cars to become the third wheel in New York, in Paris, and in London. And I want to hand things over to our first panelist, who is a friend of mine, someone I've worked with on advocacy issues here in New York, John Orcutt. Sorry, actually, I'm going to start with Rachel first. We'll start with Rachel first. Sorry, Rachel, if you're there. Dr. Rachel Aldred from London. She is a professor of transport at the University of Westminster and the director at the Active Travel Academy. She specializes in active mobility. If you've read probably any article in The Guardian, the New York Times, anywhere, you've probably seen her research. So Rachel, I will hand it over to you. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Doug. And yeah, I'm just going to reflect for, I don't know, 5 or 7 minutes, something like that, on can we make private cars obsolete in relation to London. So London is where I personally have lived for 22 years. It's an amazing city with some long-standing problems. In terms of making private cars obsolete, it has in some ways made some great progress. So in 1993, half of all trips made by Londoners were made by car. By 2003, this was down to 43%. By 2013, we'd got that down to 36%. So car trips have gone from being, you know, really quite a normal thing to something that was a minority of trips. Only just over 1 in 3 trips made by Londoners was made by car. And this kind of a shift is, I think, you know, quite unprecedented in a lot of contexts, certainly in the UK, the fact that you would get car trips down from over 50% to going on a third in the space of 20 years. But there is a but. Since 2014, that figure has been stuck at around 35% for 5 years in terms of the proportion of trips of Londoners made by car. And it goes up slightly when we include taxi, private hire and motorbikes. That goes up to 37% of all trips by Londoners. The target, London's target, is to get down to 20% of trips by those modes by 2041. So that's quite, that is quite a big challenge to go from 37% of trips by private motorised modes to 20% of trips. And, in over 5 years, we haven't actually really been able to change that mode share. And if you think about the fact that if the percentage of personal trips by car remains the same, while the population grows, you tend to get more cars on the road. That if we want less traffic on the road, we need to be getting that percentage down, not just for the target, but also to reduce the amount of motor traffic that is, polluting the roads, that is causing problems for us, causing road injuries and so on, as well as obviously carbon emissions. And we also have the problem of freight trips. So while we've been able to get car trips down somewhat, we've seen recently a rise in van trips. Because a lot of freight, a lot of last mile deliveries even are done by van. We also recently found out that motor traffic on minor roads in London, residential streets, has almost doubled in a decade. So, a lot has been achieved, but some of the progress seems to have stagnated. In some respects, some things have actually got worse recently. But there's also a lot of hope. Even though in 2019, we were only just about edging 3% of trips made by bike, there is potential for an awful lot more trips to be made by bike in London. Transport for London has calculated that 2/3 of currently motorised trips are potentially cyclable all the way. So that's without, thinking about combining bike and public transport, which could work for some others. Most of those trips, nearly 5 million of those trips daily, are made by car, trips that could potentially be cycled. Progress in reducing car ownership, we've made some progress, but it's been relatively slow. There's been a 2 percentage point fall over 15 years. In inner London now, that's the part of the city that is closer to the centre, but not just the central area. In inner London, 3 in 5 households are car free. But in outer London, only 1/3 of households are living car free. And most people live in outer London. London is a suburban city. Its density is half that of New York City, half that of Greater Paris. So we need to find solutions that work for those suburban areas. In the current COVID situation, we've been seeing more walking and cycling, but we've been seeing less public transport, and we've been seeing more car driving, particularly car driver trips. So people also have stopped car sharing, understandably. So the real worry is that if we don't make a change, then we're going to see a car-based recovery, and we're going to potentially see some of that progress undone. But there are positive signs that radical policies can help get us back on track. So, for instance, London has been introducing lately what we call low traffic neighbourhoods, which are a policy for residential areas. It's about reducing motor vehicle traffic through residential streets. This is quite a controversial policy, as you can imagine. But one thing that's interesting about it is that it is suitable for suburban residential areas. And the idea is to turn residential streets into places that are safe for walking, cycling, children's playing, and so on. This seems to have an impact on car ownership. We've studied some early low traffic neighbourhoods, and we found a 6% fall in car ownership rates in 2 years, alongside a big rise in walking and cycling. They've also been rolled out quickly. So 4% of Londoners, 1 in 25 people, has been covered by new low traffic neighbourhoods in 6 months last year. That's 300,000 people. They're also more common in poorer areas. So there has been some quick change. There has been there have been things happening for walking and cycling. People, I think, are more aware of space that's allocated to cars and space that's allocated to walking and cycling. So we found out that only a third of footways in London are wide enough for social distancing. So most footways in the city are not wide enough for people to give 2 meters distance when passing. We know that streets where most people don't own cars are full of parked cars. Another positive thing that's happening is that we're seeing an extension of our low emission zone in London. So that's going to be extended to what we call the North and South Circular, so a large part of inner London. So that's going to make quite a difference to pollution on some of the worst polluted roads. But at the same time, the Silvertown Tunnel is being built, which is the big new road scheme. So things are kind of mixed. We're seeing borough level. So London has 33 districts, boroughs. So workplace parking levies are back on the agenda in the new London plan. So potentially separate boroughs might make employers pay to provide car parking. So that's also quite interesting. But the worry is a patchwork of schemes that don't provide consistency. So low traffic neighbourhoods have not been implemented by 10 boroughs. They're only implemented in 2/3 of boroughs. So some people have cycle tracks, some people have low traffic neighbourhoods, some people have good public transport, but other people don't. And I think the big question in London is how we make active and sustainable travel work beyond the centre, beyond some of the inner areas. Because this is a city, as I mentioned, where 3% of trips are by bike, only 3%. And yet on some central London bridges, 50% of vehicles crossing those bridges in the morning peak are bicycles. So it's really concentrated. In central London, there's lots of cycling and walking. And in some parts of London, there is very little. And this is also a city where those, as was alluded to earlier, Hirra alluded to, that those who most need access to private mobility have least access to it. So the people who use cars most have in many ways the least need for them at the moment. So how do we allocate mobility based on need? And also to return to something that Doug said, while we focus on reducing emissions, we shouldn't forget that many people, don't go out as much as they'd like. Many people are scared to cycle. Many people can't afford a car. Many people find walking unpleasant. It's not easy to cross the roads. The footways, sometimes are full of cars. And so, if we reduce car dominance, private car ownership, hopefully we'll get a lot more local walking. We'll get a very different city, a more sustainable, a more livable, and a more equal city. So I think I absolutely agree with focusing on the positives that we can get. It's not just give up your car. It's, we can have a city that's very different. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was great. I also want to remind everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A when our panelists are done speaking. We will take some of those questions and I'll be able to answer some of them. So now I want to introduce my friend John Orcutt. John is a former director of policy at the New York City Department of Transportation under Mayor Michael Bloomberg and Commissioner of Transportation Jeanette Sadiq-Khan. He was instrumental in the rollout of many of the bike lanes in New York and also the launch of City Bike, the bike share system here. He is an advocacy consultant and does some work with Bike New York now, and just a great guy and a friend. So John, please take it away.
Thanks, Doug. I want to just sort of tell the story about New York and sort of get a lot of information to you guys in just a few minutes. So let me give you these slides. Hopefully you can see them and they're working now. We've been doing a lot in New York over really the last 15 years. And there's some very significant cross currents and difficulties that we're facing, we still need to overcome. And, if anything that we've learned over the last 8 years, it's that progress is not inevitable. We made major strides in the second half of the Bloomberg administration, and we've seen some of our gains start to slip, and we've seen some of the difficulties in actually just doing things right. So let me dive in right away. The story of changing streets in New York really starts in 2007 when Mayor Bloomberg launched a sustainability initiative, brought in Jeanette as the transportation commissioner, as Doug mentioned. And we really, went fast, and we started changing streets and taking what I would call surplus street space and using it for different things. Revitalizing our public realm became, a real policy and something we talked about a lot. So, and we had people saying, look, you have a city with no public seating. You can scurry through New York, but you can't really hang out and enjoy it. So we started to change that, and we started really squeezing down some of our big streets, and we did it in a variety of places, a variety of neighborhood types. What we didn't quite get to, big pedestrian streets or networks of pedestrian streets, but we did start to create public spaces out of some of the stranded areas that were surrounded by major streets. And the famous one many of you may have seen, Times Square. We pedestrianized Broadway through Times Square. You can still drive in the area, but you can also spend time. And the people who had to sort of battle and sort of engage in a mosh pit of pedestrians on a very small margin of the streets. is over, and now there's room to move. We also pioneered ways to quickly put in safe places for bike riding in the city, mainly just by moving parked cars off the curb and creating a third space on the street quickly. Didn't require construction, didn't require a whole lot other than a lot of public debate and argument. And we went pretty quickly with bike lanes. This is the bike lane network before all of this started, and it was pretty half-hearted. It's mostly paint, and this is what it was sort of at the end of the Bloomberg years. And a lot of it still was paint, but it seemed to really bring out at least a population of cyclists that just needed a little bit more than incoherent streets full of traffic. And we did start to pioneer those protected bike lanes. I don't have this map sort of going forward from the Bloomberg years, but it has continued to expand under Mayor de Blasio with much more emphasis on protected bike lanes. I'll talk a little bit about how that's working in a minute, but this has continued to expand. And here's kind of the macro view. These are the oldest bike counts we have going back. And so you can see around the time that we really started building out the bike network, we had really steep increases in bike use. And then we do start to see some leveling off later in the de Blasio years. Brooklyn Bridge has capacity problems. And then you can see the pandemic further to the right, where we've seen another sort of real step up in bike use. Two of these bridges showed declines. This is kind of a wonky metric in order to get the comparison going back for 2 decades. These bridges in terms of total volume all year actually did go up. Brooklyn Bridge was again flat last year just because there's just really no room on that. Pressure campaigns have actually led the mayor, today's mayor, to say that we will get new lanes for cycling and walking on both the Queensboro Bridge and Brooklyn Bridge over the next couple of years. So we are seeing some progress there. When Mayor de Blasio came in, he adopted the Swedish national policy of Vision Zero to really try to drive down traffic injuries and deaths on the streets. And what many of us were hoping was that that would be a rubric for the mayor to continue a lot of the Bloomberg street policies under the de Blasio administration. De Blasio was elected kind of as the anti-Bloomberg. So the fact that he was finding a policy framework in order to continue a lot of these streets policies, we thought was really promising. And we were hoping it would be a way to bring more agencies, more of the city government into this vision. New York city government is very big. A lot of people in city government don't talk to each other and they pursue their own goals. And we were hoping this would change. Hasn't really worked that way. We have seen a pretty good reduction in traffic deaths in the city. And you can see the long-term trend is going in the right direction, but we haven't really seen the kind of step change down. And this is never a straight line down, unfortunately. But there's a sense that the de Blasio team has kind of lost the plot on Vision Zero. And to the extent Vision Zero is a policy that says when there are trade-offs on the street to be made, we will bias safety. We will prioritize safety. We're not really doing that in the city. And to some degree, there is the trend that a lot of the street changes the city's been making have been overwhelmed by new car traffic in the era of Uber and in the era of massive increase in truck traffic. I talked about the extension of protected bike lanes. Unfortunately, many of them look like this. These are all new protected bike lanes under the de Blasio administration, so-called protected. But they're not functioning well. And part of the problem is the mayor is not a good administrator and he doesn't have skills as a leader. So city agencies are pursuing their own agendas. So we have one piece of city government pursuing bike transportation, but the lanes are not enforced. The lanes are not respected even by other parts of city government. The lanes are designed in a compromised way so that they're not really set up to succeed. So we need to change those things. So the bike network looks good on the map, or it looks better on the map than it did when the mayor was first in office in 2014. Still very difficult to use, still very daunting to people who are not robust cyclists who are comfortable with heavy car traffic. we are seeing some increase in the sort of completely physically separated and constructed bike lanes, but it's excruciatingly slow. We are, in large measure, the idea of painting our streets and moving parked cars around was a substitute for the fact that we do street construction very badly. And I think there's a lot New York needs to learn from Paris and London in terms of being able to do physical construction quickly for these kinds of improvements. Things got bad enough with the cycling crashes, injuries, and fatalities that we had. We had our first mass cyclist die in Washington Square Park in the summer of 2019. And we sort of remains to be seen how the safety trend continues into the post-pandemic years. One thing that's going well in New York, and I wanted to point this out since we do have good comparisons using Oliver O'Brien's World Bike Share map, is the march of bike sharing across New York. After a couple of years of kind of stasis in the middle of the de Blasio administration, we're now embarked in a major expansion of the bike share system on the way to 40,000 bikes in the city, and additional expansion in some of the parts of New Jersey that adjoin New York and are connected to it by subways, where we'll have a joint system on both sides of the Hudson. I think we haven't seen that kind of expansion in the other cities represented here, but it has been a game changer in terms of people wanting bike infrastructure in their neighborhoods, and it's still very fashionable in New York to complain about where bike share is not. And so there's pressure to continue to expand it, especially further east into Brooklyn and Queens, south into Brooklyn, and further north into the Bronx. But we've seen a more, like kind of a tripling of the system since it was first launched in the last year of the de Blasio, the last year of the Bloomberg administration, and have moved on. We have tried to innovate with our bus system, but this I think is the thing that that gives me the most concern in where we are in New York, and that is our public transit system is faltering, and this goes back several years before COVID, and it's an American problem in general. There's a philosophical problem in America where we don't treat public transportation as a public utility that is there for everybody. We really treat it as a last resort for the poor, and that's become increasingly the case even in New York, where we have a huge system, where we have a very transit oriented and transit dependent city. We are not putting the frequency of service that we need to keep ridership up. We are not clearing bus rights of way for the most part. We have kind of a one-off success with the 14th Street busway, which was launched in, I'd say 2017, 18, I'm forgetting, but we're not following this up very vigorously. And these are a series of pictures of how things have been changing in the city, and they kind of show what a disaster it's been for New York to have the kind of unrestrained deployment of Uber and similar facilities, similar kinds of services in New York, where year over year we're starting to see increasing car traffic, increasingly obstruct buses, and lack of investment, lack of good policy in public transport continually erode what should be a growing use of subway and bus in our city. And I haven't updated this, and this will have to be picked up again as a new thread after the pandemic. People are avoiding public transport in the city today because of safety concerns that are overblown, and that really the officials in both the city and the state are not countering and telling a real story about how public transport could be functioning better. In the pandemic, just to close, we have created social distancing space on our streets, and it has opened a lot of people's eyes to what we can do with street space, how streets as public spaces can function better. I mean, even though we pedestrianized Times Square and launched public plazas throughout the city, the idea of the public realm really fell off the map during the de Blasio years towards sort of a more mechanistic approach to engineering streets to be less dangerous. And we need to bring back this idea of the public realm. And the pandemic is terrible, but it's brought that conversation back to the city in a very strong way. But I will say the city government's approach to all of this has, the main good thing that they've done is really get out of the way of the citizenry and the private sector and allowed people to take over the curbs and the streets for people. Because the city, our approach here has been extremely bare bones. We don't have sophisticated planning for low traffic neighborhoods. We don't have networks of pedestrian streets. We have these kind of blocks and pieces of blocks that have been allocated, but and I'm not sure we really know what to do with them going forward. It's been up to the people themselves to really implement these things, and that's not a fair way to do it. Not everyone has time to move barricades around in their neighborhoods every day. So I think we really need to systematize this, figure it out, in the next few years, because for all of those pictures, there are many, many, many more pictures like this in New York where people have returned to cars as they avoid public transport. I mean, look, bikes is a good spot. We've seen big increases where we count bikes over the 2019 to 2020. Again, I don't know that progress is assured if we don't move quickly to sort of seize on this and support these people who are trying to get around by bikes. There's another look at it just in a few places, near my neighborhood, where you see the pandemic dip, but then the big percentage increases, which actually grew during the colder months as people, continued to use bikes. People needed to use bikes as their transport. It's not clear that we're really seizing the moment here and supporting these people, connecting up our bike networks. We had a little pop-up bike lane program during 2020. It was really a failure. It was not well supported. It was not well thought out by the city. So, what do we have to look forward to? Fortunately, we will have a new mayor next January. And many of the mayoral candidates who are running today are talking much more robustly about all of these issues in terms of moving buses, streets for people, connected bike lane networks, expanding City Bike even further to the neighborhoods that don't have it. And we do have a legislatively approved congestion pricing program, which has been waiting in the wings. It was held up by the Trump administration, but I'm also not convinced that the state government, whose job it is to do that, is ready to go with congestion pricing and is prioritizing it and moving it fast enough. So we will see. We have many tools at our disposal. We have good trends that we can capitalize on, but we have a lot of dysfunction in our city, and it's not clear which direction things will go. I'm hopeful, but I'm very also cautious and concerned.
Thank you, John. And I think that's, one thing you said in there that I've noticed was that move from, I don't want the city bike station on my block now to why isn't there a city bike station on my block? So I'd like to stay optimistic and think if we do more people will start saying, hey, wait, why isn't this on my block? But the challenge of all of our cars flooding our city is a huge problem. I want to move to our next speaker. This is Frédéric Héran from Paris. He's a transport economist and urban planner at the University of Lille, and his research focuses on sustainable cities and mobility, and he's published works on transport nuisance and cycling, and he is working on a book about the ecomobile transition. Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation and for this initiative. I can't see my picture, so I will talk about the evolution in Paris and the Île-de-France region. Just a minute. I've been told to remove the original sound. So you need to ask yourself, are car-free cities the objective that should be put forward? It's a very attractive objective for those of us who are already convinced that we need fewer cars in our cities because of all the nuisances they cause. But it's still just a motto, and it could be misunderstood and even proved to be counterproductive. It's easy for journalists and opponents or anyone to say that we will always need ambulances to bring someone to a hospital, fire engines to put out fires, lorries to bring products to shops, taxis to bring guests to the hotels, police cars, cars for people with disabilities, but also a garage for those of us who still may have a car to go to the countryside. So instead of asking to have a car-free cities, I think it would be better to ask for cities with fewer cars, much fewer cars, and here are some figures. There are 2.2 million people living in Paris. It's a main city in the Île-de-France region, which has 12 million inhabitants in total. In the last 25 years, Paris has already reduced by half the traffic in its streets. It has increased by 30% the number of people using public transportation, multiplied by 12 the number of people using the bikes, and promoted vigorously walking. These are the figures for the city of Paris. And people are not always aware of these figures. Very few people know that has already been achieved, and all this was done without having any negative impact on the economy of Paris, contrary to what some businessmen may have said previously. So in 1995, Paris started to limit the traffic in its streets, and with the mayor Bertrand Delanoë, and the work continued with the new mayor Anne Hidalgo. So today in Paris, only 10% of all the trips are done by car. But we can still go further and divide automobile traffic by 3 or 4. But more specifically, the main problem now is in the inner suburbs. And we can see some evolution in the outer suburbs too. So we have some towns, quite famous towns like Montreuil, Saint-Denis, towns with approximately 100,000 inhabitants, which are strongly promoting transportation without cars. It's not Paris, but it's close to Paris. So in order to do so, instead of being overly ambitious and critical by saying that we want car-free cities, it seems to me that we could adopt a softer approach by defending principles that will surely bring tangible results once they are applied correctly. So let's talk about some of these principles. And let's see how Paris adopted some of them and how it's trying to implement them. I wanted to highlight 7 principles. There are more than 7 principles. So let's start with the first principle. So it is to rethink totally the hierarchy of the means of transportation. Instead of giving priority to cars, priority should be given to any other means of transportation. First, to pedestrians, then to cyclists, then to public transportation, and the car should come last. This new hierarchy should be debated now in our society. So the city of Paris still hasn't really adopted this point of view. Nevertheless, it's obvious that these active means of transportation, like walking and cycling, are the most virtuous ones. They're the more inclusive means of transportation, and they produce fewer nuisances. They are more democratic, and they've already been discussed in many countries and cities. For example, we have the example of the Green Party in Belgium, called the Ecologists. We have the city of Bogota, the capital city of Colombia. We already adopted this principle. Mexico has voted a law to enforce this new hierarchy. So things are moving forward in many parts of the world. The second principle is to keep on reducing the speed of the motor vehicles on all types of roads. The motorways, the avenues, the boulevards, the streets, in the neighborhoods and the districts of our cities. Everywhere it may be a good idea to reduce the speed limit. And we already done a lot of work on this point in Paris, because the speed limit in Paris is almost everywhere 30 kilometers per hour. So we're not only relying on these speed limits at 30 kilometers per hour, we also have what we call quiet areas, like pedestrian zones, where cars are banned, and we're making progress in the capital, but also in the inner suburbs, but also in more remote suburbs. Paris is now organizing a public debate online to adopt a new speed limit for the whole city, with the exception of the ring road and the large avenues where the speed is already limited. The third principle is to suppress the transit of motor vehicles in all the districts of Paris. Cars can still go to one specific district, but they cannot go through it. So Paris is lagging behind on this part, but we're catching up. It's one of the projects fostered by the new mayor, Anne Hidalgo, for her second mandate that started in 2020. She wants to turn the center of its district into a quiet area. And in order to do so, it's important to reduce or suppress the traffic in the streets located in front of schools. And Paris has designed a very ambitious program for this. We have approximately 1,200 schools in Paris, and wherever it's possible, the municipality wants to turn the streets into pedestrian areas or reduce the traffic drastically. The fourth principle is to suppress all the four-lane roads, or even larger roads, in the urban centers to make them quieter and make it easier for pedestrians to walk around. Paris has already made huge progress on this point. So we have many large roads and avenues that have been transformed, and now we only have 2-lane roads instead of 4-lane roads. And we try to do something similar in the suburbs. And we do this more specifically when we are building tram lines to reclaim some space from cars. The fifth principle aims at transforming all the urban motorways into avenues with trees, sidewalks, and cycle lanes. So we have many big cities all around the world have already started to do like this. Like for example, in New York, we have the West Side Highway, which is now an avenue. And Paris wants to turn the Ring Road into an avenue. And we also have other projects, and as Cathy said in her presentation, the A186 road is being redesigned, and it's slowly becoming an avenue with a tram line. So we have the momentum, and we have a bright future ahead of us. So it will be difficult to transform this ring road because its height varies quite a lot in various parts. So we'll probably need a lot of time to do it, but the municipality has already announced it will do it. The sixth principle aims at transforming all the crossroads into squares by giving more space to pedestrians and less space to automobiles. During the last 15 years, Paris has already worked on a dozen major squares in the city. In all cases, 2/3 of space was for automobiles and only 1/3 for pedestrians, and now it's the opposite. 2/3 of the squares are dedicated to pedestrians and 1/3 only for automobiles. We still have some major squares that need to be overhauled, but it will be done progressively. The seventh principle is to adopt a multi-year plan with the necessary funds to tackle what we call linear disruptions and surface disruptions. Linear disruptions are motorways, railways, roads, and surface disruptions are blocks, housing developments, commercial areas, and all the areas that cannot be crossed by anyone. So we intend to build gateways, bridges, tunnels, so anyone can cross easily these areas. It's not crucial for Paris because the city is well organized and we have a very dense network of roads and streets. For example, the Seine River can easily be crossed, except when you are on the ring road. And we may have a few connections and a few bridges there, but it's a huge problem in the Ile-de-France region. So, for example, we need much more bridges to cross the Seine River in the suburbs. So in 2014, the region voted a plan to tackle more than 100 of these urban disruptions. And that's just the beginning. The program is moving forward, and we've already dealt with approximately half of the disruptions. But we still have a long way to go, and our work is far from over. So I'll stop here my presentation of these principles. All these principles deserve to be discussed democratically and implemented with a thorough follow-up based on some simple indicators. And I'm convinced that these principles will help us not to have car-free cities, but at least cities with much fewer cars. And thank you for your attention.
Merci, Frédéric. Thank you. I want to kick off our Q&A with just one question. If all the panelists you can unmute yourselves and put yourself back on video, Frédéric, John, and Rachel. And while you're doing that, I will just ask this general question to kick things off. John touched on this a little bit in terms of city dysfunction and different things that are sort of getting in the way of moving faster. But I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about what you see as other barriers to moving more towards a car-free status, and then what opportunities also exist within your respective cities to continue this work. Rachel, do you want to go first? Because I feel like John touched on this already a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, something that I guess I already touched on to some extent was the way in which governance in London is fragmented, and the fact that there's a lot of, there's inconsistencies between districts, and there's also things like the congestion charge and the different types of road pricing. I think everybody knows that that needs to be consolidated, improved, updated, and so on, but it's not really been taken on. So I think that's a big thing. I think also the fact that the COVID situation has meant that London in some regards could push on quite quickly with some things, but it also limited the extent to which you could have, for instance, co-design of new spaces. And something that's been very successful in Barcelona, for instance, around removing cars, has been around allowing local neighbours, children, to redesign spaces, to do pop-up games and so on. And that hasn't really been possible for us. And I think that's a big problem, because it means people don't maybe feel the same sense of ownership of that space.
I could jump in.
Sure.
I mean, we don't have, the frustrating thing about New York is we don't have fragmented government. We have very unitary government and a virtually omnipotent mayor when it comes to city streets. And and people have been writing about it in the chat here. Paris is the example of what leadership who knows what it wants to do can accomplish. And you just, you need a leader who's going to cut through the noise and cut through the nonsense and show people what a city can be. And and I think we did that to some extent in New York under Bloomberg. We just have a mayor today who's just really uninterested in the physical city, or not willing to put political capital into changing the city physically. So you really, we really have a tough situation in bringing the tools to bear that we could be. And so I really think, I mean, to the extent people are really putting their efforts into educating the people who want to be the next mayor, that's where we're going to really realize the potential that we have, is finding that leader who wants to do this. And and I think we are setting an agenda for the next mayor already, and that's seems to be going well, but you never, you can't forecast that.
Exactly. Frédéric, do you have anything to add?
Yes. So what's happening in the Île-de-France region, and more specifically in Paris, is that there's no true cohesion between the transportation policies. The transportation policy in Paris, in the Paris region, is globally coherent, but not completely, because, for example, the motorcycles are still a very sensitive topic, and the mayor still doesn't dare put the motorcyclists in their place. Nonetheless, there's still a project of charging the parking of motorcycles, which may lead to fewer motorcycles and less nuisance. But the main problem is not Paris. Things are actually going smoothly in Paris and in the city centre, but the main problem is the Île-de-France region. And there, the transportation policy is lacking consistency because Frédéric, the president of the region, wants to please everyone. And there's nothing worse than this. You want to please everyone. It means you want to encourage people to walk, to take their bikes, to take buses and metros, and why not, to reduce congestion and traffic jams. And as you may know, if you try to please everyone, you please the car drivers. Why? Well, because as soon as you give them some space, they end up taking all the space available. They're the strongest. They are the more agile. And as soon as you try to improve traffic, we see less congestion in the short term. But soon after, they saturate the space that was given to them, and traffic jams are back again. This is what we call the traffic induced by the infrastructure. So, unfortunately, the policy on the regional level is lacking cohesion, and I don't see how we could come up with something more coherent unless we can prove that we can reduce congestion.
Way of thinking, though, to say that the congestion will not decrease, will not. So we have to see a change on the regional level, on the local level, and not in Paris itself.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. When someone tries to please everyone, the cars generally win. It's a little bit like saying everyone has a right to swim in the ocean. The children, the surfers, and the sharks. The sharks are probably going to be the ones that wind up taking up most of the space. We do have some questions from people in the Q&A, and the one I wanted to start with,
Oui, très juste.
if each of you,
You're exactly right.
Start, we're talking about London and New York and Paris and the good work that they're doing, but when you look internationally, or maybe even, in your own backyard, in your own country of other cities, what do you see? Which cities around the world do you think are doing it right and we can look to for inspiration?
I mean, I would venture just two that I've witnessed and follow, Montreal in North America and Munich in Europe.
Anybody else?
Moi, je pense, je peux prendre la parole.
Well, I think, if I may say a few words, I think that Paris, but as you understood me, the downtown, Paris downtown, Paris is quite a good example. We could talk about different cities, for example, Barcelona, for all the efforts made to reduce traffic in the various districts, what we call the supermanzanas. It's really interesting. We can also talk about Copenhagen or Amsterdam for bicycles. We have many different cities that can be clear inspiration for us. But we should think about how we should, or we could get inspired by what all things are done somewhere else. We can't always cut and paste a solution from one city to another. We always need to think how to adapt these solutions to your own city or town.
Yeah, I'll just add something to that, which is an important point. That also what inspires me as well is not necessarily the perfect. It's places that have got a lot to, to struggle with, and that they've managed. They don't have everything easy, but some Latin American cities, some of the progress that has been made there, often in difficult contexts, where people have managed to build social movements supporting more equal streets. Some of those contexts inspire me, but they're not perfect now, but they've made such great strides, and I think it can be more inspiring than something that's already perfect.
And Rachel, I'll let you maybe start off on this next question. We have a question from Lucy. It's about the low traffic neighborhoods in London, and I've been following this. There's been the typical sort of backlash against some of them, even though they're popular. I recently saw, I think, a survey today that showed majority support for some London traffic neighborhoods, and yet some of the councillors have ordered them taken out. So, how do regular people, and this is true in Paris, Anne Hidalgo faced a bit of backlash during her mayoral campaign, and it's certainly true here in New York. Anytime we put in those city bike stations, someone complains about losing parking. What recommendation do you have for people to fight back against this and make it known that there is generally broad support for these initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question, and it is applicable to a wide range of schemes, I think. I mean, I'm happy, by the way, if people want to talk more about low traffic neighbourhoods, for them to email me individually. So I'll just be a little bit broader here. I think we often think that low traffic neighbourhoods have attracted a sort of unique vitriol, and maybe sometimes that's the case. But I think also any kind of scheme that restricts space, that restricts time, that charges motor traffic is always going to be challenging and unpopular. And of course, many of these schemes, potentially there are problems, at least in the short term, when you have disruption and so on. So I guess I would say one of the things that it's important to keep in mind is that, the importance of having a narrative of things being different. I think one of the problems is that people cannot imagine that the traffic can go away. They imagine there will always be this amount of traffic. Even in London, where there's been a fall in motor traffic, it's hard to imagine that the traffic could evaporate, go somewhere else, even though we know about induced demand, as Frédéric was saying. And therefore, I think giving a vision of things being different, and the fact that it's not just a case of pushing traffic somewhere else, but there is the possibility of change, there is the possibility of things working differently, is really important. And also, I think, good monitoring and evaluation, and they're two different things. Evaluation is more longer term and is more comparing the impacts of schemes to where there are not schemes, and monitoring is more shorter term and identifying distinct problems, issues that you might need to deal with. Schemes may need to be moved, changed, adjusted, and so on. So I think that's in good communication, which has obviously been very hard during COVID. But the advantage of the way in which things have often had to be done very quickly, but doing things experimentally as a trial, putting them in and seeing what happens, can, I think, be really powerful, because it's hard to imagine a scheme till it goes in, but if you can actually see it and experience it. But also, I think decision makers need to hold their nerve and not remove things after 2 weeks, because in 2 weeks you really don't see the impact of anything.
Frédéric?
Oui, moi je veux bien parler du stationnement à Paris.
Yes, I would like to talk about parking places in Paris. For example, I think in Paris, approximately around 1990, we are approximately 350,000 parking spaces. We only have 130,000 parking spaces left. We divided almost by 3 the number of parking spaces, and the mayor who got elected in 2020 decided to divide the number of parking spaces by 2, and one day we won't have any more parking spaces in the streets of Paris. So we can, it may be a possibility, it could be possible by 2030 or 2035. We may have parking spaces for delivery or for people with disabilities. So it's possible, can be achieved. We can have streets without parking spaces. And I had a question asked on chat. So we have a question about how we talk about something called the evaporated traffic. It's a concept that really exists. It's the complete opposite to induced circulation. When we have more roadway, a high number of ways, we have more cars, and the same for parking spaces. They have inducing a bigger number of cars. So when we reduce the number of parking places, well, we have less cars. We can see that we have fewer cars. Why? Well, so we did this on the banks of the Seine River. Say we have the Seine River right in the middle of Paris, and we have like this high-speed lanes we call the Quai de Berge. So we blocked these high-speed lanes. So now the banks of the Seine River are now open for pedestrians only, and it was extremely successful, and people really were very satisfied with this. But it was highly criticized by big companies, but nothing happened. People say, "You're about to kill Paris. You're killing the spirit of Paris." But the city didn't die, and still here and thriving. So now traffic is more flexible than we may think. When we block these high-speed lanes, well, people will adapt. Drivers will adapt. People may adopt new means of transport, like by changing their journeys, by traveling less often. And they have different ways to adapt. And things are going smoothly, to be honest, because we divided the traffic in Paris by 50%, and Paris is still here and still thriving.
Paris is definitely still there and doing very well. There's a question in the Q&A about changing attitudes around cars. I have my opinions about educational campaigns and public service announcements and their efficacy. I tend to think that just changing streets is the best way to build a constituency for changing more streets, but it remains a fact that you need the political support often to do that. And so someone in this question is talking about how we changed attitude towards getting people to wear seatbelts in cars, or changing attitudes towards smoking that led to better policies that ban smoking from restaurants and bars in many cities. Do you think where's the room for a good public service? What's the educational component of this that will go towards helping us move towards more car-free spaces?
Well, Doug, I'd like to sort of address that partly by, raising another piece, that gets to your original question about some of the barriers that we face. One of the things we've seen in New York is in communities, majority communities of color, there's been some identification of street changes with gentrification and displacement. And one of the things, and that's been a very difficult, set of debates and conversations. And one of the things that I think is changing that, and which is one of the really hopeful things in New York, is that we have a lot of leaders of color in the streets reform community now. And some of them are elected, and some of them are advocates, some of them are community leaders. And I think they are absolutely essential to all of the things we're talking about in the future of New York. And it's one of the reasons we're seeing the candidates for mayor saying as strong of things as they are right now, because this movement and this conversation has really diversified. And I'm really curious, because Rachel, you mentioned you're actually seeing better effects from low traffic neighborhoods in some lower income areas. How that kind of race and class overlay is affecting the debates that you're a part of. And I'm curious about that in French cities also. But the messenger can be very important here, I think. And that's what gets to your point, Doug, about education.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear about how that's going in London, Rachel. How do we change that message? And like John said, make sure the message
Et comme John a dit, alors... Les interprètes excusent, nous n'avons plus de son. I can talk about gentrification in Paris, which is a big problem. So, in terms of gentrification, it's something that is not well seen, not just within the framework of Hidalgo. People talk about making it a policy for rich people, but maybe not rich people, but at least the middle classes, while forgetting the lower classes, the popular classes. Now, the answer to this is that this requires solidarity between towns, between the entire Paris region, and we're very far from that. It's true, we're really very far from that. There has been progress, but it's been rather weak. But the problem is very well known in Ile-de-France, and there have been efforts, but they're too feeble. Now, on principle, we need to requalify public spaces everywhere. And there needs to be a strong will to do so. So if you put a lot of money into the Champs-Élysées, then you also need to put a lot of money into other neighborhoods in the Ile-de-France area. Now, this is not something that we can count on. We're very far from that. But it's something that is understood. It seems clear that in Paris, some of the neighborhoods in East Paris are quite well managed, better and better, and less money is put into more preferable neighborhoods in different areas of Paris.
I'll just say a couple of things in response to those. So around John's point, I think that, looking at what some US cities are doing, I think, to be honest, in London, in terms of diversifying active travel advocacy and centering equity, I think we're a bit behind North America. I think we could do more in that regard. And I think one of the things that I'm quite excited by personally around the Active Travel Academy is that we've just had a call out for projects around social justice, diversity and active travel, and we had lots and lots of applications. And so it shows that there's a lot of interest in this area, and there's a lot of interest in having more representative advocacy and having equity more front and center in a whole range of dimensions. So I think, to be honest, I think London's still on that journey, and I think certainly we can learn quite a lot from what's happening in North America. I also wanted to say something about the cars and the comparison between tobacco and cars, because I think that's a really interesting one as well. We had one of the last events we held before the COVID shutdown was called Are Cars the New Tobacco? And I think we can certainly learn something from the very, very long struggle during which cigarettes were framed, went from something that doctors promoted and recommended to something that was completely outside the pale. And, medical researchers won't take tobacco money. It's seen as something that is completely different. So I think some of the tactics around that could potentially be useful in thinking about how we deal with the power of the car industry, which is so substantial and so much of a problem.
Yeah, I would also add, I think, to the comparisons that, drunk driving in the United States and in many places used to be seen as acceptable. It used to be seen as, oh, what's the big deal? And if someone was killed by a drunk driver, it was that person was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it wasn't the driver's fault. And we saw those attitudes change through the powers of families, of mothers against drunk driving. And here in New York, we have Families for Safe Streets, which is now just changing the culture around reckless driving itself. And so it doesn't seem like it's going to be that much of a bigger leap now to perhaps move towards talking about, do you need to take the Cadillac Escalade 1 mile to buy a gallon of milk? That seems ridiculous. And we can start to hopefully change those attitudes a little bit. I think we have time for one quick last question. And I would love to talk a little bit. We just touched on this in terms of gentrification and representation, but there still remains an idea, I think, especially outside of the big cities, that cycling is like a white male activity. And I was wondering if you have good strategies, you think, for beyond just representation and imagery, like how do we branch out to really make sure, because that's not really true in New York. Delivery cyclists are largely Chinese and Spanish, Mexican immigrants. And the lower income down you go, the more cycling you tend to see, and certainly the less car ownership you see. So I'm wondering, what are the best ways to really start broadening that conversation and countering those arguments that it's just for you know, a privileged white person like myself who lives in a nice neighborhood in Brooklyn.
I could say something briefly on that. I mean, I think there's two, well, there's different points, but one thing is about which cycling is visible and which cycling is counted. And very often there might be cycling that is happening among different communities, among different age groups or whatever, but is not really counted, is not prioritized. If we're thinking mainly about people, say, commuting to financial centres, we're not thinking about delivery cyclists and so on. So there's making the cycling that is happening already visible. And there's also things about spatial planning. So there's been some interesting work in the past looking at public transport and how public transport serves some communities' trips better than others, and models of fares and things like that. And I think if we look at where cycling infrastructure is built and what kind of trips it serves, then we'll find, you know, we often find stuff about that as well. There's been, again, some good studies from North America looking at cycling infrastructure equity. And, you know, okay, it may be serving journeys to a financial centre, a business district, but it isn't necessarily serving the warehouse district or whatever. So I think there's a range of issues, but visibility and planning are really important.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, the data I was able to show on cycling in New York is all very central business district oriented. We have automated counters for bikes in the city now, and we need to have them in East New York, in the edge of the city, in an African American neighborhood, which I think is becoming a cycling hotbed because of revitalizing the Jamaica Bay Greenway and the opening of Shirley Chisholm Park. If we connected that a little bit better and we started counting it, I think we could show tremendous data from neighborhoods like that. And I think that will be true in central Queens and in the Bronx as well. But we need to do that. I think the Willis Avenue Bridge probably has a huge amount of bike traffic right now from the Bronx into East Harlem, but we're not counting it.
And Frédéric?
Il n'y a plus de son.
Frédéric, did you have anything you wanted to add to? We're going to let you have the last word if you'd like.
Oui, le vélo est en train de se...
Yes, so cycling is becoming more and more popular. So if you look at any kind of good for consumption, people don't use it at the same time. Look at the television. People, only certain people began watching it. It was only a certain type of people. It was more wealthy people, educated people who had a certain size of capital that started watching TV. They were the people who started watching it first, and it's the same thing now. People who are from educated areas, who take care of their health, but it's something that changes. It's something that becomes more popular. Then we see lots of interesting things. For example, we see that deliveries are made by a certain type of population category. We see that people learn, all people learn how to cycle at a young age. We can see that in London. I mean, it's incredible. There's a movement called Bikes Up, Knives Down, and that's extraordinary. I would love us to talk about it, because this is a way of cycling that nobody had ever really foreseen. This movement is increasing in France, in Paris, and in certain other towns. So bikes are becoming more popular. It's also done more by women, by immigrants, by anyone.
Great. I think that's a good note to end on. I want to thank our panelists, Rachel, John, and Frédéric, for joining us and sharing your experiences from your respective cities. To everybody watching, we have another panel coming up very soon, so please check the program. And then we have a third panel coming up in the afternoon. You're free to stay on and watch all three or drop in as you can. But many thanks to all of you. Merci.
Thanks for having us.
Merci.
Thank you very much.